Going to open our Bibles once again, and this time we'll open them to Psalm 3. Psalm 3 will be our text for this morning. You can notice as we begin reading Psalm 3, the superscription, or the others would call it a title, but a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son, as we just read. Begin reading at verse 1. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me, many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept, I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord, your blessing be on your people. As for the reading of our text. Brothers and sisters, it is true that this human life is full of pain and struggle. And if we think about the problems and struggles that perhaps people would face, even in just this church, we would have to acknowledge that that's true. I mean, think about it. Some of us are physically ill and suffer things like chronic pain. Some of us are elderly. Our bodies are physically frail and our minds seem less and less with it as time goes on. Or perhaps we have other struggles, relational struggles. We have relatives or children who consistently make choices that harm them and others. We have family members who hold themselves at a distance, refusing to be reconciled. Or perhaps we have challenges in our marriage. Instead of love, we have hurt and distance in our marriage. Or perhaps we want children, but it doesn't seem to be in the cards. Or perhaps we would love to have a spouse, but that has been denied us as of yet. And even beyond this, we can think of things like finances and material wealth. Some of us are barely holding it together, or others are slowly drowning as rental rates go up. Others are building a career or a business, and it's not easy. Our options seem limited, and our customers don't pay. What's more, we see worrying signs from our culture. Our culture mocks us and shares memes online that mock our view of life, for example. Defending the rights of the unborn or our views on marriage and sexuality are under attack. And on top of all that, our own sin wearies us. We can barely control our anger. We feel guilt over the things that we've done. Or perhaps our sexuality seems to drive us and our lust bubbles up. I could go on for a long time. Never mind the fact that our local church or the church that we belong to struggles to find a pastor. Problems develop in the congregation and it's hard to work through them. Every Sunday we hear a different preacher, may or may not understand us. I could go on again, I could keep going, but I'll add one more comment here. I can only imagine how much more could be said for the families that live outside our church who don't have a church. If Christians suffer, who can imagine how those who are not Christians suffer? What suffering exists behind their doors? The point is that we have a lot of problems and suffering. And as hard as we try to ignore it, it's a fact. These things tend to beat us down. They tend to drive us to despair. What do we do in the face of suffering? How do we respond to it? How do we respond to it in a healthy way versus an unhealthy way? The good news is that today we're reading Psalm 3. And Psalm 3 is written by a man who was suffering intensely. And as we work through Psalm 3, we will see that David, the man who suffered intensely, found a way to cope with this suffering, a healthy way, a good way. And by watching him find God in his suffering, so can we. We'll see under this theme, as this life beats us down, the Lord brings hope in the morning. We'll begin with one, our enemies and our problems. Now you'll remember that we read 2 Samuel. We read about David's flight from Absalom, which the psalm is said to have been written by David in that scene. Who is David? Well, David is King David. He's king of the Israelites in 1000 BC. What's important about King David to know about this psalm is this. In David's time, in the Old Testament, God chose the kings of the nation. And God raised David to be the king of his people, Israel. And God loved David, and David was a man devoted after God's own heart. David was a good king and a king blessed by God. However, there's a critical piece of information to understand this psalm. David, despite the fact that he was a good king, a Christian king, a king who loved God, he made mistakes. One of his biggest mistakes was to lust after the wife of another man, to sleep with her, and then have her husband killed. Her name was Bathsheba. And God saw it. And God punished David because of this sin. And as part of the punishment of David's sin for killing another man and sleeping with his wife, God had said from David's own household, calamity will come upon David. And in 2 Samuel 15, we read about the promised calamity. Absalom rises up to take the nation from David, and civil war erupts among David's people. Israelite fights Israelite, and David is forced to flee from his capital city, Jerusalem, and he flees across the Jordan River to the other side. Think about how David must have felt. Civil war. The nation he had worked so hard to protect, to build, turns on him. His own people proclaim his son king. A son that David knows does not have a strong faith, if any. And worst of all, David doesn't know friend from enemy anymore. Anybody could turn on him. And it seems to be his own fault. This is a punishment for what David did. And everyone seems to be against him. And so David writes a psalm, and in verses 1 and verses 2, he talks about his situation. He says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God." And the thing that cuts to the heart, and you read it in 2 Samuel 16, you read about Shimei. Shimei was of the family of Saul, the previous king. And Shimei, David is running from Jerusalem, and this man Shimei comes after him, and he's cursing him. He's saying, "This is all your fault. You're a man of blood. It's your fault. You killed my father's family, or the family of Saul. All of this misfortune that's happening to you, it's because of you. You deserve it." And what cuts to the heart for David, so much is going on, but what cuts to the heart is that they're mocking his faith. Shimei curses David, and then others are going another step further. They're saying, "David, God is not going to save you. God doesn't care about you." And the implication is that even though all of Israel has turned against David, now people are saying God has turned on David. God's not coming, David. You know what, David? You finally sinned too big. You sinned so big that God is not going to forgive you. God is out to destroy you, David. You've got nothing. Now let's stop here and think for a second. Like David, our lives are full of problems and struggles, aren't they? Enemies, we could say. Many of us feel as if our problems seem to multiply. There never seems to be an end to the problems that we face. But here's where Psalm 3 prompts a question. As bad as things are, how do we respond? And before I talk about how David responds to the attacks of his enemies, we need to think about how we often respond in a bad way. If we're honest, most of us respond to our pain, the heat, the suffering we face in various ways. Usually not healthy. Usually there's a mixture of willful ignorance and escapism, blaming others, anger. Or perhaps we keep ourselves super busy so we don't have to think about our problems and suffering. Or if we can't escape or keep ourselves too busy, instead we wallow in crushing anxiety and despair. If we're in a really bad spot, we use substance or drugs to try to medicate the pain. Or some of us, we just let our problems crush us and destroy our self-esteem and will to live. We choose the drug of despair as a response to our problems. And David was tempted by that too. You can see how David's fleeing from Absalom, and there's a certain amount of despair in his flight. Shimei curses him, and David's like, who cares? I'm nothing. David was probably doing a lot of this too, at first. For some of us, we look down on those who fall into despair. We're more industrious. We say things to ourselves like, no one else will fix your problems unless you do. Pick yourself up and get something done. Get busy. Solve your problems head on. There's a time for that. But often there's another lie in that too. Not all problems you see can be solved with human effort alone. In fact, very few really. Those of us who live this way often try to become our own Jesus, solving our own problems on our own. And that makes us brittle, because when we fail anyway, we're shattered. But again, this is our second point, God's place in all of this. What does David do in the face of his enemies? I mean, first he falls into despair, he runs, things look bleak. But then if you read 2 Samuel, the end of chapter 16, you'll notice this curious, David crosses the Jordan, and you'll notice this curious verse. So 2 Samuel 16, verse 14. It says, and the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan. Long journey, lots of people, dusty, fearful. They could have been attacked at any moment. But then you see at the end of the verse, and there he refreshed himself. And how exactly did he refresh himself? Did he swim in a pool? Maybe. But what was it that refreshed David in the flight from Absalom? And it turns out that it's God. Look at verse 3. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. The mocking of David's enemies actually does David a favor. The mocking of David's enemies points him to God. It offends him enough to go to God. And this is the beginning of any way out of suffering. You see, despair is inherently self-oriented. All despair and sin is a curving in on self. They even have a Latin term for it, curvatus in si. Sin and Satan wants you to focus on yourself and your problems and your own despair and, oh, woe is me. And another closely related problem is to focus entirely on your problems. This is not wise either. In fact, one commentator said this: if one gazes too long upon the enemy and his might, the enemy grows in the mind's eye to gigantic proportions. But the hypnotic power of the enemy is broken when one turns one's gaze to God. You see, obsessing over your problems is a poor way to overcome them. This is why thinking too much about the devil and his power is always a mistake. The Bible does not do that, neither should you. Your problems often are as big as you let them be, as your focus allows. But again, David's enemies, they mock him by saying, no, God has left you. God is not going to save you. And David goes, hold on a second, is that true? And then when he reflects upon who God is, he says, no, that's not true. No, you, Lord, are a shield, my glory, the lifter of my head. You've done that in the past. You will do it this time. God is a shield. If God is a shield, if God will protect me every single time from every single enemy in my life, why am I afraid? There's nothing, Romans 8, there's nothing that can overcome the love of God for my heart, for me. So again, why am I so afraid of enemies then? Well, the truth is that most of our fear in this life exists because we've made something God instead of God. We rest in something other than God at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the thing that gives us comfort is not God. When the chips are down, what is it that keeps you going? Is it your bank account? Is it the love of friends and family, maybe? You know, when the chips are down, it's because my husband's there and that'll be it. You know, when the chips are down, at least I have my reputation. At least my kids will be there to protect me. At least I'll have a house to live in, right? But if those things are the final comfort, those are the things that give you comfort, then fear will be the condition of your life, because those are things that can disappear and be taken. You will always fear that your comfort will be taken away. David is saying, God is my confidence and my shield, and that cannot be taken, no matter what accusations are made about my punishment or what I've done. You might say, is that really true? Is it true that God would never leave me? Maybe at this point we should remember that the cost of God's love for you. Jesus Christ, God Himself, came to suffer and die for you. If that's what God did for you, why would He let you go when you face bankruptcy? Why would He abandon you even though thousands of enemies pursue you down a trail and want to destroy you? No. If God sent His Son to die for you, then of course He's willing to protect you. Our misery is often because God is taking something from us that we don't want taken away. A friend moves away, maybe. We lose function in one of our limbs. Our business loses money. We go, oh, that's awful. I can't stand losing this. And God says, but you don't need that, and you can't take it with you. I'm here. David also says the Lord is His glory, which means His army and His kingship and His reputation and His status in Israel is not His glory. He can live without being king. When we make human things our glory, we are cruising towards misery. But David's saying, no, God is my glory. what's great about this life, what's great about my life, what's great about my kingdom is that God is in charge of it, that God is near. It's not my image. Here, one of the church fathers said, he said, some people place their glory in country, family line, beauty, strength of their bodies. Those things are your glory. You will forever fear losing them. And then the Lord is the one, the lifter of my head. When I am in despair, it's God who lifts my head out. Again, can booze, can drugs lift your head? Can money lift your head when you're deep in that pit? What's the power of those things versus the God of heaven and earth who can reach into your heart and lift you from the pit of that despair? God can do things that we can only dream of. And when does He do it, and why does He do it? Listen, verse 4. I cried aloud to the Lord, and He answered me from His holy hill. You see, when we're in the depths of despair, when life is beating us down, calling out to the Lord is the beginning of the way out. The first prayer in a bad situation is the beginning of the end of that situation's hold on you. Why? Because God can actually do something about your problems. It's fascinating. It's happened to me more than once in Brampton. Someone comes to me with a major struggle. Perhaps it's a person I've never met before. They don't even belong to the church. And often when we dig into the reason why they came to me, the reason why they walked into church, at some point in the past, they've prayed. Maybe once in their whole life, they cried out to God for rescue. They lived in a foreign country, saw a drug deal go bad. Could have been shot, but they weren't. They cried out to God for protection in that situation, and years later they walk into church and they find Jesus. The prayer was the beginning of God's deliverance in their life. It's not to say that God delivers people who don't pray. But the point is, if you call to Him and ask, He comes. Maybe not in the way you want, but He will answer. And to those who cried out to God, even who are far from God, God leads them to the rivers of water in the church. And if He can do that for those people, imagine what He can do for you if you call out to God in your situation and actually ask Him for help in dealing with the problems you face, instead of thinking you can deal with them yourself. If you think you can solve your problems on your own, then God will let you try. But if you cry out to Him and you give it to Him, if you have the humility to give it over to Him, He will act. And this is the beginning of the climb out. That's what David did. He's pursued by thousands of men who are pursuing him. They're calling for his blood. They're mocking him, saying, God will never save you. We've got you. What we're on God's side. We're doing God's will in your life by destroying you. David says, no, God's going to deal with this. God did not put Absalom on the throne of Israel. God did not do that. And Absalom's arrogance and thinking he could seize that throne meant that God was going to deal with him. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but David knew that. And it's funny that David comments on the holy mountain, the holy hill, he says. You can say holy mountain. This is important because Mount Zion was a symbol of God's provision of David as king. God gave David Jerusalem, where the holy mountain where the temple was going to be built was going to be. That's where David put the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. That's where David worshiped God and knew God. It was a central place of worship for him. And he knew, he said, the God who gave me Jerusalem, who put me in charge of this country, he's going to deal with Absalom. God is not absent. He's present in this country, and he's going to deal with the people in this country who do not obey him. God is not absent, David is saying, and he's going to bring help, right? He says, he answered me from his holy hill. Again, prayer. He prays to God, and he knows God, to a God that he knows is present. Again, prayer. If you don't, prayerless people are people who think they can solve their own problems. David is saying, I can't solve this. It's done. If God doesn't act, nobody can. What's funny is if you read the Psalms, incorporate prayer in almost every psalm. Prayer is often the central thread in many psalms, linking the problem to God's salvation. Again, almost every amazing thing that I see in Brampton is an answer of prayer in some way. And often when we discover somebody was praying, it's a moment of revelation. And often when I talk to someone and I say, did you pray about this situation? And if they answer yes, what did you pray for? And then, okay, wow, that's what you prayed for. This is the beginning of the way we're going to get out of this. Because God loves to rescue people. He gave his only son to rescue the whole human race. And the prophets prayed for this for generations, and it came, and look what was accomplished. If God, that's what God's heart for rescue is. In the macro, think about what his heart for rescue is in the micro, in the little things of your life too, or the big things maybe. And so we reach point 3, punching evil in the face. Look at verse 5. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. See, there are consequences to David's prayer. He believes that his prayer has been heard, and so now what? Number 1, he sleeps. A giant army is pursuing him across the land. He crosses the Jordan. He falls asleep. His advisors must think he's crazy. Why is David sleeping on the job in a moment of great peril? Well, because he actually believes that his prayer has been heard. He knows God's got it. David realizes that even if the worst would occur, it still wouldn't justify anxiety and obsessing today. What is anxiety anyway? Anxiety is simply the matter of living in the future before the future happens. The present, there's one present. There's a million futures. And if you worry about the future, you have to worry about the thousands of potential futures. Nobody who can possibly sustain that load. But the present, there's one present. Far easier, far more beneficial to think about the present rather than the thousands of potential futures. Jesus says that in Matthew 6. Do not worry. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Think about this situation. Even if Absalom was victorious and David was killed, worry would still not be appropriate. Whose nation is Israel? God's. Israel didn't need to have David as their king. If David died, then God would raise up another king. He would rescue his nation. God's got it. And David realizes that, and he sleeps. How much more then, if David could sleep in this situation, ought you to be able to put your anxiety to bed and sleep today? Israel in many ways is like the church today, really. In the Bible, there's that line of continuity. Many of us worry about the church, or we worry about our families, or whatever. Here's a confession. I often obsess and worry over the church and the people in it. It's easy as a pastor to be consumed with thinking about the problems of the church and the people in it. All the potential solutions that you might have to help people with or whatever. You make yourself miserable worrying about all the potential problems that could develop in the church. And then there's this self-centered thinking. If I don't solve this, then it can never be solved. Oh, this whole thing is reliant on me. No, it's not. Jesus died for the church. You think maybe he cares about it? In fact, Jesus is sitting in the throne room of heaven, obsessing over the church and obsessing over you and your family and your life, and especially this church. He's listening to our prayers. He's expressing his love for us and giving us grace day by day. And so if he died for us, how much more then would you think that he obsesses over us? And if he's obsessing over all of us, then we don't need to. In fact, we can sleep because God's got it. Faith, you see, is the basis of sleep. Now, there may be other reasons why we can't sleep, medical reasons, I get that. But for those of us who don't have those, faith is the beginning of sleep. Look at what he says. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. The Lord is involved in my sleeping and my waking up. Every morning I wake up, it's because the Lord raised me up. Every night I sleep peacefully, it's because the Lord sustains me. It's both. If the Lord woke me up this morning, then he's real. I will not fear then. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people. They're nothing. Yes, my enemies are legion, but God is bigger. But then David does something unusual. He sleeps, and then he goes another step in the next verses. Verse 7, he urges God to do something about his problems. Arise, O Lord, save me, O God, my God. God is a God of rescue, and so David urges God to be a God of his word. God promised things to David. God promised David an everlasting line of kingship, and David's like, okay, do you mean it? And also, if you don't rescue me from this army, there ain't no rescue. And then look at what's next. For you strike all of my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked. This is my third point, punching the enemies in the face. You, God, punch my enemies. You strike my enemies in the face. So should we pray for God to punch our enemies in the face? Well, there's a little bit more to this. Hitting someone in the face biblically is an insult to them. It's a way to humiliate them. David's enemies were humiliating and insulting David and God by suggesting that that God would not save those like David. David is saying, no, humiliate and punish those who dare to insult you. Humble them. And then also smash their teeth. Why this reference? Well, teeth are a reference to the weapons of the enemy. You smash the teeth of a lion, the lion can no longer hurt you. And so smash the offensive capability of my enemies. Render them defenseless and incapable of hurting people. In other words, destroy the ability of my enemies to create and perpetrate evil. And so David is not asking God to destroy his enemies. He's asking God to humble his enemies and destroy their ability to do evil. Which suggests that the real problem, David suggests, is evil. The problem isn't his enemies per se. The problem is the evil that his enemies are filled with. Which suggests that the prayer we ought to pray in our life is, God, stop evil from winning. Stop evil from consuming the hearts of my enemies. Stop evil from having victory over me. Stop evil desires. Stop all of that. Stop sin. Was Absalom the enemy? No, Absalom's sin was the enemy. Later on, David's army defeats Absalom. And at the end of the battle, Absalom's stuck in a tree. His hair gets stuck in the branches of a tree, and he's stuck there, and he's hanging there. David has ordered his army not to kill Absalom, but in disobedience to David's orders, Joab, the army commander, goes and strikes Absalom dead. Now you might say, is David right? Was David right to say, don't kill Absalom? Or was Joab right to kill a rebel to the nation? If we read Psalm 3, we discover that David had a point. What David wanted was to humble Absalom. He wanted to humble Absalom and show him the path of the Lord. David wanted healing for the heart of Absalom, more so than the death of Absalom. Joab did not understand that. And that's the profoundly different attitude that a Christian possesses versus any other person. We want healing for our enemies rather than their destruction. Nevertheless, God may destroy them. And this attitude pervades our response to every problem. The solution to our lack of money is not necessarily more money. Perhaps that is the part of the problem, a part of the solution. But really, what we want in any situation is greater dependence on Christ, greater godliness, greater love for those in our lives, greater forgiveness. And yes, greater means perhaps, but maybe a different attitude to our means. Like David, we're not just looking for victory in battle. We're looking for victory over the hearts of those who oppose us so that they become like God. And see, when you pray to God and you pray to the Lord with reflecting on His Word, you suddenly discover a different orientation to dealing and looking with your problems. The things that we think should happen, suddenly we realize maybe that's not really what we need. Look what he says in verse 8. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. God will save, and He will do so in His way. You would never know that if you don't pray to Him or read His Word. If you try to solve your problems on your own, it's like throwing darts at the wrong dartboard. You can read a lot of self-help books which help you be better at throwing darts. But if you're throwing your darts at the wrong dartboard, what's the point? But when you go to the Lord and He's able to renew your heart and soften your heart and fill it with love and grace and forgiveness for other people, suddenly you think you might actually throw one dart at the right board. You might actually look in the right direction for salvation. And perhaps you'll see that God has already delivered you. That the salvation you thought you would find from money or career or other people's love and respect, whatever, wasn't really what you thought you needed. Would any of us, if asked today. Imagine you were not a Christian for a second, and I came to you and I said, the thing you need is Jesus Christ. You think people in this world have come to that conclusion? No. They don't even know that they need Jesus. If that's true for them, how much more then for us finding the right solution to the problems we face? We're not very good at discovering what exactly it is that we need. And yet God knows, and He knows, and His answer to all of this, His salvation from the Lord, was Jesus Christ for you. And if He sent you Jesus, if He sent you His own Son, how much more then would He act in your life, if indeed you ask Him to do so? And so instead of obsessing over our problems and constantly being anxious, go to the Lord. Go to someone who knows the Lord that they might help you. Think about what your Lord and Savior Jesus would do for you and want for you. Then pray for that thing. And how would your life change then if Jesus was intimately involved in everything that you do? He is already at work in every detail. The question is whether you're looking. David knew this 3,000 years ago. And God did deliver him. You see that? A powerful army, most of the nation arrayed against him, God wins. And David dies as an old man, despite fighting wars nearly every year of his life. If David knew that then, if he saw the rescue of the Lord then, how much more then ought we to see it today? Amen.